Chapter 18. Looking back at it, I think it was fortunate that Moon Boy and I were preoccupied with images of a mad mummy creeping up from a tomb to the room where Grief of Dawn lay helpless in bed. It distracted us from the details of hell, and some of them were very, very unpleasant. We were approaching the river Hao Nai Ho, which is the boundary between the first and second hells. It is spanned by 3 bridges. One is gold and is used by visiting gods and their emissaries. One is silver and is used by the virtuous. And the third is a ramshackle bamboo bridge with no handrails that is used by sinners. The sinners scream in terror as they try to cross the river. Inevitably, they fall off, and horrible bronze dogs and snakes splash through the water with jaws gaping wide. The water bubbles with blood, but it's merely a foretaste of what is to come, because the mangled bodies wash up on the far bank and are miraculously healed, and laughing demons lead the sinners to places where torment begins in earnest. Master Li marched toward the gold bridge, while Moon Boy bellowed, "Make way for Lord Li of Kao, emissary of the Son of Heaven!" And we proceeded past glaring demons and over the golden span, as though we owned it. The second hell punishes dishonest male and female intermediaries and ignorant or unscrupulous doctors. The torment is not one of the terrible ones, but the smell is revolting, and Moon Boy and Master Li clapped handkerchiefs to their noses. I was used to barnyards, so I wasn't bothered very much. We made our way down long lines of pits, and finally Master Li stopped at one where a fat fellow with a mournful, flabby face was buried in soft manure up to his chin. Even through the reek he could smell living flesh, and his eyes slowly lifted. "Now look here, Li Kao, if it's about that land I sold you—" "Nothing like that," said Master Li. "I had no idea there was alkali in the soil. May heaven judge if oh, shit." "Well, you should be an expert on that subject," Master Li said cheerfully. "Actually, the Yama kings were quite lenient, considering the fact that you sold some of the same land to your own father." The fat fellow began to weep, and tears made pale furrows in the brown goo that covered most of his face. "You wouldn't bring that to their attention, would you?" he sobbed. "You can't imagine what the Neo-Confucians are doing to this place. They'd send me to the 8th hell, and that's horror beyond belief." "You should see what the same fellows are doing to China," Master Li said gloomily. "The other night I dreamed you had returned as court physician, and I hadn't been so happy in years." It was difficult to draw oneself up with dignity under the circumstances, but the fat fellow tried. "Not all of my patients died," he said huffily. "Some even managed to walk again, and 1 or 2 didn't even need crutches." "The ones you treated for colds?" "Colds are pimples. It's not the physician's fault if a patient is lunatic enough to come in with a case of hangnails," the fellow said reasonably. "You were a doctor in a million," Master Li said warmly. "Who else would have prescribed arsenic oxide for hiccups?" "It worked." "No patient is in a position to dispute it," Master Li said somewhat ambiguously. "Medical expertise is not what I've come to see you about, however. Do you remember the walking trip we took in Tungan? It must have been 80 or 90 years ago, and I've reached the point where my brain resembles the stuff you're buried in. All I can remember is a girl in a scarlet sampan." The transformation was amazing. Flab appeared to melt from the fat fellow's face, and I realized that he had once been a light-hearted and rather handsome young man. "You remember her too," he said softly. "Li Kao, not a day has passed in which I haven't thought of that girl. Wasn't that a time? She sang autumn nights and tossed rice cakes into the water, and laughed as we dove for them, like ducks. By all the gods, I hope she made it to heaven." "Wasn't there a festival?" Master Li asked. "A wild village one. Masks and drums and monkey dances, and that big farmer picked you up after you'd blackened his eye and crowned you king of fleas. We stayed drunk for a week, and they gave us gifts of food and flowers when we left." He gazed sadly down at his manure pit. "What a wonderful thing it was to be young," he whispered. Master Li told us to keep our eyes peeled for demons, while he leaned down and tilted his wine flask at the fellow's lips. It had been a long time between drinks, and he gulped a quart. Buddha, that wonderful stuff. Haining Moon Mountain Dew? The best, Master Li said. You were an avid botanist in those days, and I seem to remember that after we left the girl in the sampan, we set out cross-country. We passed a temple or a convent, and when we climbed into the hills you discovered— "The Bombay thorn-apple!" the fellow cried. "How could I forget it? The find of a lifetime, and I always planned to go back, but somehow the world closed in on me, and I never did." "Could you find it now?" Master Li asked. The fellow looked up with sudden intelligence in his eyes. "So that's it. You need a Bombay thorn-apple, do you? Dangerous stuff, Li Kao. You always did get involved in the damnedest things, and how you managed to keep alive is one of the great mysteries of the Empire." Master Li leaned down with the flask again. "What a pair we are," the fellow said when he stopped coughing. "I'm damned, and you're demented. I may be a sinner, but at least I know it isn't nice to deprive children or lunatics of their toys. And if I wanted the only Bombay thorn-apple I've ever seen in China, I'd go about 2 miles past the White Cloud Convent to the point where the hills are closest to the road. I turn east and start climbing. Shale, followed by granite, followed by some kind of black rock, and past the black rock I'd come to a clearing in front of a cliff. Tunnel through the brush, and right against the cliff is another tiny clearing, and in the center is a Bombay thorn-apple, unless somebody's cut it down for firewood and massacred his family and neighbors in the process." His eyes moved to Moon Boy and me. "Something to do with Beauty and the Beast, eh? Take care, Li Kao. This is the soft area of hell. Later on you'll need a better passport than a state umbrella." Master Li bowed and turned to go. "You know, the Yama kings are stern, but just," he said. "Good intentions can at least partially mitigate bad results, and the great wheel waits patiently. Who knows? After a couple of insect and animal incarnations, you might find yourself poling down the Yangtze in a crimson sampan." The fellow looked up with desperate hope in his eyes. "You couldn't possibly have sneaked a look at the Register of Souls," he whispered. Master Li winked. We started off down the path, and the last I saw of the fellow, he was weeping with joy at the thought of being reborn as a sampan sing-song girl. And the last I heard of him, he was practicing autumn nights. The torments of the third and fourth hells are also relatively light, and are designed for such sinners as bad bureaucrats, backbiters, forgers, coiners, misers, dishonest tradesmen, and blasphemers. Serious torment begins in the fifth hell, where murderers, unbelievers, and the lustful are punished. I will make no attempt to describe the cauldrons of boiling oil, the pits of molten lead, the beams of hollow iron, the hill of knives, and the sawmill. Master Li told me that such things are utilized by most cultures, with the exception of the Tibetan, and that the Yama kings had no intention of instituting the unspeakable atrocities of the Tibetan world of darkness. According to the Register of Souls, Tao Wan had been damned not for murder and torture, but for wanton carnality, and the fifth hell provides such sinners with beds in which to cool down. We marched down rows of beds formed from sheets of ice, to which sinners were held by frozen iron chains, and naked bodies shuddered unceasingly, and the air was loud with the sound of cracking joints. We came to the wife of the laughing prince in the 50th row. I was not prepared for her youth and beauty. Like the others, she shuddered and jerked in her chains, but she made not a whimper, and her eyes were open instead of being fastened shut by eyelids thick with frozen tears. Master Li bowed deeply. "Princess, I hope you will forgive the intrusion," he said. "We had hoped to interview your noble husband, but he appears to be unavailable." Her lips parted with the sound of cracking ice. "Unavailable?" "Somehow he managed to dodge the bailiffs. Do you have any idea how he managed it?" She managed an ironic laugh, and I decided she was the toughest person I had ever met. They should have searched for his soul inside the stone, she said. The stone, Master Li exclaimed. Wherever we go, we keep running into references to that stone. Would you be kind enough to enlighten me on this subject? Ta Wan's voice was as cold as the ice she lay on. Guess if you like. If you guess right, I may answer 1 or 2 questions. I shall guess that the stone was broken into 3 pieces, and the largest piece was placed in a sacristy, and the second largest was used by your husband as an amulet, and the last sliver became the tip of your hairpin, said Master Li. You guess well, old man, the princess said. Suma Chen broke it, the meddling fool, and he wasn't even half right about it. He called it the stone of evil, and his mistake cost him his balls. What would you call the stone, old man? Master Li looked thoughtfully at her. I would not call it evil, and I would not call it good, he said slowly. I would call it a concentrated life force that in the hands of a saint could heal all wounds, but in the hands of your husband could wound all heals, if you will forgive the sophistry. Better and better, old man, Ta Wan said. Her eyes closed. Ice began to form over her lips. I thought she had ended the interview, but then her body shuddered and jerked, and the ice over her mouth cracked. It was not his. It was never his. It was mine. A lover gave it to me. Lovers always give me things. I was 10 when I let a boy think he had seduced me. He gave me his mother's rings. A pretty boy, so easy to train, like a dog. Lie down, sit up. His father came for the rings, and I trained him too. Roll over, beg. I led him around on a leash that only women could see. How they hated me, the sluts! They made me his number 7 wife, and I persuaded him that his pretty son to go to a war where they were sure to be killed. Su was the lawyer, and Kung Sun was the magistrate. Lie down, sit up, roll over, beg. I threw the other wives out into the street, and then Yi Shao the merchant with his jewels and carriages, Governor Kuo with his houses and land, wriggling like good little dogs begging to be petted. I could not train Prince Liu Sheng, but he gave me a crown. It was his steward who gave me the stone. The stone. Holding it against my skin, feeling the pulse, my husband stole it from me and drove me mad. Madder than I believed possible. The little Tor, the big Tor, 1,000 seconds, the embryonic pearl. Kill! Suma broke the stone, and all I had was the sliver from my hairpin. That maid, always looking at it, always wanting it, trying to steal it. I stabbed her, but she ran away with my stone. My maid, and that concubine with the ring of Upwat my husband gave her. The soldiers killed them, but they could not find the stone. It was mine. All of it was mine. My husband refused to give me a second piece. He laughed and showed me a tender poem for my coffin, and then he made me drink poison. Mad monks in motley dancing and laughing around my bed. Colder, mist, sounds of water baleless, pulling me into a grey world. Yama kings, freezing. Ta Wan's eyes opened. She looked at me. Peasant boy, you would have made a good little dog. Her eyes were deep and wondering as they moved to Moon Boy. You, I would have worshipped. Her eyes moved to Master Li. You I could neither have worshipped nor broken and trained, said the princess. Old man, I fear you. Go away. Master Li bowed, and Moon Boy and I followed his example. Ta Wan's eyes closed, and her mouth shut, with a sound like the click of a lock. I raised the state umbrella, and we marched on down the path. What an extraordinary young woman, Master Li said admiringly. The phrase tougher than Ta Wan must enter the language, and we should try to do something about her bed of ice.